Yaser Abdel Said, a cold-blooded killer, arrived in the United States with dreams of a bright future. However, his cruel nature quickly revealed itself. Over time, Yaser's arrogance and aggressive behavior grew, leading to crimes far beyond murder, haunting the entire community. He murdered 9 of his close family members, becoming so ruthless that he landed on the FBI's most wanted list. The most horrifying act was the brutal killing of his 2 daughters. After committing these heinous crimes, Yaser fled, aided by some family members. For years, he evaded capture, making it extremely difficult for law enforcement to track him down. Yaser Abdel Said's case raises troubling questions about the fine line between faith and abuse. Can religion be used as a tool for such heinous acts? Texas, the land of brave cowboys, mouth-watering Tex-Mex cuisine, and warm Southern hospitality. With nearly 30 million residents, Texas boasts a rich history worth exploring. Sports fans think of the Dallas Cowboys football team and the Dallas Mavericks basketball team. Music lovers know Texas as the home of Kenny Rogers and Roy Orbison. Texas continues to be a favorite destination for immigrants and hosts a more diverse community compared to the rest of the state. It is currently one of the fastest-growing cities with a very dynamic economy. And one of the families living in the Irving suburb was the Said family. The main character of this case is Yaser Abdel Said, born on January 27, 1957, in Sana'a, Egypt. Born into a well-off family with 2 brothers, Yaser lived a happy and prosperous life in Egypt until his parents divorced, and his father remarried. This meant that Yaser and his siblings would no longer receive financial support, forcing them to build their own futures. After seeing his 2 brothers emigrate to the US and find success, Yaser decided to follow in their footsteps. Although he initially came to the US as a student, this status was set to expire in early 1987. At this time, Yaser and his brothers were nearing their 30s. This is where the first shocking detail emerges. One of Yaser's brothers tried to court Patricia Owens, who was only 15 years old at the time. After being rejected, instead of respecting her decision, Yaser's brother tried to gain her trust. Surprisingly, this led to a relationship between Yaser and Patricia. Just 1 week after dating Patricia, Yaser proposed to her. There were plenty of alarming signs from the start. Despite the age difference, under Texas marriage law, this union was legally allowed. All that was required was the consent of Patricia's parents, and they seemed to agree. Although Patricia's family appeared cautious, they believed that Yaser would be a good husband for their daughter. After a brief courtship, the two eventually got married in a church in February 1987. Yaser and Patricia were determined to build a family together, and by the time Patricia turned 18, she had 3 children with him. Their first child was a son, Islam, followed by 2 daughters, Sarah and Amina. Yaser wasn't highly educated and mainly earned an income by working as a taxi driver. However, his dedication seemed to change over the years, and he often faced issues with his employers. Most local companies refused to rent him taxis, but Yaser's last employer seemed to hold him in high regard. His co-workers described him as erratic and unpredictable, and despite some support, they didn't have many positive things to say about him. Yaser was quite reckless, unafraid to work in chaotic downtown areas and deal with violent construction workers. By this point, he was known for always carrying a gun while on the job. As you might have guessed, Yaser was not a good man, and family conflicts were bound to arise sooner rather than later. As previously mentioned, Patricia's marriage to Yaser at the age of 15 was likely a grave mistake. The poor young girl found herself trapped in this marriage. Over time, Yaser's violent nature began to emerge. Feeling inferior to his brothers, he started working extra shifts to earn more money for the family. However, from Patricia's perspective, Yaser never seemed to earn enough to support the household. Their eldest son, Islam, was clearly favored over their two daughters. He was allowed to call his mother by her first name and was blatantly given preferential treatment. It became clear that Yaser and Islam viewed themselves as superior to Patricia and the girls. According to his family, Yaser was always paranoid, constantly worried that others were plotting against him. These baseless suspicions led him to control everything within the household, the only place where he felt any semblance of power. This growing frustration and irrational paranoia would eventually turn into a disaster for the women in the family. Not long after, as things spiraled out of control, Patricia became completely drained. In 1997, in a moment of desperation, she abruptly left with the children. However, Patricia couldn't stay away from them, and by March 1998, they were reunited once again. Patricia agreed to move back in with Yaser in a different house in Covington, near Hillsborough. But the financial situation still did not improve. Yaser started working at a local store, and the family continued to live in poverty. By the end of 1998, Patricia once again left with the children, this time with the involvement of Child Protective Services. The reason for their intervention was extremely alarming. In recent months, both daughters had confided in their grandmother that they were being sexually abused by their father, Yaser. This news devastated their grandmother. They went to the police station to report it, and a case was opened. However, despite the serious allegations, Patricia hesitated to leave Yaser. Although charged, the two daughters eventually retracted their statements and even claimed they had lied about the abuse. Personally, I find this very hard to believe. I think both daughters might have been under immense pressure or even threatened to retract the accusations against their father. But by the beginning of the following year, Yaser was no longer facing any charges, and Patricia brought the children back home. Soon after, Yaser's other disgusting actions began to surface. He started monitoring his wife and daughters, both inside and outside the house. After they began working at a convenience store, Yaser started stalking them from his car, watching their every move, and even getting angry when they smiled at strangers. All right, now I understand. Every father is responsible and worried about his children growing up, especially when his daughters are approaching an age where they can be independent. But Yaser's behavior here was completely out of control. By the way, Patricia, Yaser's wife, accompanied him during these trips and showed no resistance, nor did she do anything to stop him. In essence, she was enabling his behavior. Honestly, his disgusting actions were repulsive. Not only outside, but even inside the house, he was doing the same thing. Unfortunately, it went far beyond ordinary surveillance. Amina and Sarah became so terrified, even when receiving calls from friends, worried that their father was eavesdropping. He was always there, lurking, just waiting for them to make a mistake. In Yaser's mind, he grew increasingly resentful of both Amina and Sarah. According to him, his daughters were becoming too Americanized and often interacting with American boys. This made complete sense to me. He had chosen to raise his family in the US after all. During this period of excessive surveillance, Amina fell in love with a local boy named Joseph Moreno. In 2004, they met through taekwondo classes. From friendship, they moved to a teenage romance. But they had to be extremely cautious because Yaser was always lurking. The couple learned to adjust and control their messages to avoid provoking him. And everyone knew that Amina's father was always listening and watching her every move. During this time, Amina started writing personal emails and poems, detailing how unhappy she was with her family life. Her fear of her father grew stronger and stronger inside her. An email she sent to her history teacher expressed this bluntly. The content of her email read, "He will kill us without a second thought." Speaking of warning signs and cries for help, classmates often questioned the bruises on both girls' arms. Meanwhile, Amina and Sarah did not hide the fact that the injuries were caused by their father. However, astonishingly, no help ever came. Like other teenage girls, Amina and Joseph planned to run away and get married. This was despite both of them understanding that they would always be in danger from Yaser and his so-called connections. In addition to his strict surveillance inside and outside the house, Yaser also began refusing to go to work unless his daughters were either asleep or being monitored by their brother, Islam. In stark contrast, he fully trusted his son, but not his daughters. Unbelievably, he even tampered with Amina's car, replacing the airbag with a recording device so he could listen to all the conversations in the car. This was typical behavior for Yaser. Not only did he control his daughters to the point of stripping them of all privacy, but he was also reckless and foolish enough to compromise their safety. At that time, Amina had no idea that her father had already chosen a husband for her in Egypt. Although this is common in arranged marriages, it is not something that young Western women typically encounter. Unsurprisingly, she outright refused the offer. This only further frustrated her father. You see, Yaser was expecting a substantial dowry from the groom's family, a sum of money paid to him in exchange for Amina marrying their son. He planned to use that money to sustain himself for the next few years. Amina's rejection caused Yaser's lucrative plan to fall apart right before his eyes. He believed she had brought disgrace to the family. Yaser became enraged by his daughter's decision. He began rummaging through Amina's phone bills, trying to figure out what she was hiding or who she was talking to. On Christmas 2007, his behavior hit a new low when he threatened Amina with a gun. This forced Patricia and the girls to once again flee the house. Along with Amina's and Sarah's boyfriends, they escaped Texas to stay with their aunt in Kansas and later found a place to stay in Tulsa. What the girls truly needed at this time was a strong mother fully committed to their safety. But sadly, Patricia once again began doubting the decision to leave. On New Year's Eve, Patricia tried to bring her daughters back to Texas. Sarah reluctantly agreed to return, but Amina refused. However, after much persuasion, she finally agreed to go home. Tragically, this was the last time her boyfriend Joseph saw Amina alive. The last words she said to him were that she wished things hadn't happened this way. On January 1st, 2008, on New Year's Day, Yaser took both of his daughters in his taxi. He seemed to be offering reconciliation, saying they would go for a drive, have a meal, and talk. However, what actually happened was far more brutal. During this trip, at 7:35 p.m., a horrifying phone call was made to the Irving Police Department. The recording of the call clearly shows urgency and violence, but the caller was repeatedly told to wait, and authorities could not immediately determine the address or location. By the time authorities found the taxi, both girls had succumbed to their injuries. Amina was shot twice, while Sarah was shot 9 times. As for their father, Yaser Said, he vanished without a trace. The story of Amina and Sarah's deaths spread throughout the local area and across the U.S. Not only did these 2 young girls meet a tragic end, but the prime suspect, their own biological father, was now on the run. Although many speculated this to be an honor killing, authorities had yet to confirm anything. However, more and more people began to believe it after the family's private life started leaking to the public. No religion condones honor killings. However, there are extreme cases where people commit murder under this pretext to try and justify their actions. This seemed to be the motive behind Yaser's heinous crime. He believed he was driven to the point of killing his daughters to restore his family's honor. But in reality, he was nothing more than a cruel and horrible father. After the murder of her daughters and the disappearance of her husband, Patricia, instead of grieving for Sarah and Amina, did everything she could to sever Yaser's connection to the crime. As time passed, emotions ran high, and both families and those around them seemed divided. Patricia and Yaser's family were convinced of his innocence, while others remained firm in their belief that he was guilty. Amina and Sarah were buried in an Islamic cemetery where, to this day, their graves remain abandoned. In reality, neither of the girls was a devout Muslim. Even Yaser himself rarely attended the mosque or demonstrated any personal faith. However, Patricia and the family felt it was the appropriate place, yet another poor decision in a long list of blindly devoted actions toward Yaser. Although friends and family had been questioned by the police, no one provided any information or evidence. It's rather strange that Yaser fired a total of 11 shots in a heavily populated area of Irving without anyone noticing. He almost couldn't have escaped without some help or support. Additionally, Yaser may have been picked up by someone since his daughter's bodies were found inside his own car. With no information about Yaser's whereabouts, the case eventually stalled, and the FBI had to consider the possibility that he had fled to Egypt. With this in mind, Yaser was officially placed on the FBI's most wanted list. Many people hoped he would be captured, or even worse. However, no one truly knew what had happened to Yaser. It was speculated that his brother, Yasin, had picked him up near the crime scene. But, due to lack of evidence, no charges were filed. Yaser's son, Islam, went to Egypt shortly after the murders. During this time, the fanatical man sent dozens of slanderous emails to Patricia's family, repeatedly delivering the same overarching message that his daughter's deaths were due to their own behavior. Although Islam's trip back to Egypt fueled suspicions that Yaser had fled the country, it turned out that he was much closer than they thought. The truth is, Yaser never even left Texas. In fact, he was hiding in an apartment owned by his brothers, and for 9 years, even after being placed on the FBI's most wanted list, he lived undetected without raising any suspicion. This seems completely absurd. Somehow, these properties must have been linked to Yaser's brothers, and it seems completely ridiculous that the FBI couldn't track any paperwork here. Anyway, in August 2017, a repairman fixing the air conditioning in the same apartment complex accidentally spotted a man resembling Yaser, as seen on the police's wanted poster. He immediately reported the sighting to the authorities, but by the time a search warrant was issued, Yaser had vanished. However, the police did find some interesting details. Just beneath the second-floor apartment balcony, there was a bush, and inside that bush, agents found a pair of glasses and dozens of cigarette butts. Now, although Islam was associated with the apartment, he was known not to smoke, but his father certainly did. Forensic experts were able to use a new technique called familial DNA analysis, and through this method, they were able to prove that the glasses did indeed belong to Yaser. After 9 long years of being on the run, they finally had evidence that he was still in the country. Following this discovery, Yaser's case cooled down again. But 3 years later, in 2020, a final and significant breakthrough occurred. Multiple reports were sent to authorities suggesting that Yaser might be hiding in a small house in Justin, Texas. Although not entirely certain, local reports suggested sightings of him. The house was located in a remote rural area of Justin, and if Yaser was indeed there, he had been well hidden from prying eyes. After setting up a surveillance team around the property, agents finally spotted Islam and Yasin bringing food into the house before leaving with bags of trash. That night, they saw the silhouette of a third man moving inside the house. This discovery raised enough suspicion to request a search warrant, and FBI agents prepared to raid the property. On August 26, 2020, they stormed in and finally found Yaser hiding inside. After more than 12 years on the run, he was finally arrested. Islam and Yasin were also arrested shortly after. The story once again became the center of attention. At this point, people not only learned about Yaser's barbaric actions towards his daughters, but also that a fugitive on the FBI's most wanted list had finally been captured. As a result, when his trial began 2 years later, in August 2022, public interest was immense. Although Texas is a state that can enforce the death penalty, Yaser did not face this charge. His defense team attempted to claim his innocence. Other members of Yaser's family even denied that this was an honor killing, arguing that if he had killed his daughters, it was simply because he had lost control in the moment. Yaser claimed he was innocent. When recounting the events of that day, He seemed to suggest that after leaving the taxi, someone had been following him and his daughters where they had parked. However, he did not provide a reasonable explanation as to why he left the taxi or why he fled and hid for more than 12 years. Sarah's frantic 911 call, recorded after she had been shot 9 times, was doubted by the defense. They argued that she may have been panicking and speaking unclearly due to her injuries, but this had no effect against the recording, where she clearly stated that her father had shot her. During the trial, Patricia confessed that Yaser had abused both her and their daughters before the murders, even recalling a time when he had threatened them with a gun. Yaser's sister-in-law summed up the situation as best she could when speaking to him in court. She said, "I call it cowardice. The only thing he did to his family was stain their honor with their own blood, and now it's his turn to face the consequences of what he's done." After just 3 hours of deliberation, Yaser Abdel Said was found guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and is being held at the McDonald Unit under the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, where he remains today, awaiting execution. In January 2021, Islam pleaded guilty to harboring a fugitive, conspiracy to harbor a fugitive, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. As a result, he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. In February 2021, Yaser's brother, Yasin, was convicted of conspiracy and harboring a fugitive, and was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Both Islam and Yasin are serving their sentences together at the federal prison in Bastrop. When you think about it, Yaser evading capture for so long and in such close proximity is quite impressive. Being on the FBI's most wanted list for a total of 12 years and remaining at large is no small feat. Yaser's crime makes this all the more bizarre. Killing both of his daughters was an utterly despicable act. But what makes it stranger is that his wife and son stood by him. Patricia's behavior throughout this case has been truly puzzling. It makes you wonder whether she had been abused by him for a long period of time. Clearly, religion was a major issue in this case. This is another strange aspect, because Yaser wasn't actually a practicing Muslim. Despite raising his children in a Western environment, he claimed this was an honor killing after his daughters began dating Western boys. Honestly, there were too many contradictions in his beliefs. On New Year's Day in 2008, Amina and Sarah lost their lives at the hands of their own father. Amina was only 19 years old, and Sarah was just 18. They had not yet fully grown up. They had their whole futures ahead of them and were trying to build lives of their own, far away from their controlling and abusive father who consumed their lives and ultimately took them away. Neither Sarah nor Amina deserved such a fate. They were hardworking, sweet, and lovable girls who were simply unlucky to be born into a family where everything was stacked against them. They suffered under the hands of an abusive and controlling father, a man who stalked them, mistreated them, and tried to maintain control over every aspect of their lives. Patricia was the woman who gave birth to them, but she failed to protect her daughters. Every time she fled with her children, Patricia always forced them to return. This was despite countless offers of shelter from her own family. Even after they died, Patricia's actions, frankly speaking, were horrific. Patricia hindered every effort to find Yaser and cared more about his honor. Although not charged, nearly every interview I've seen with her shows her defending her ex-husband. To put it simply and bluntly, Patricia had every opportunity to save her daughters. I suppose indifference and detachment from the situation were the easiest ways for Patricia to survive. Amina and Sarah lost their lives at the hands of their father and were repeatedly abandoned by the very people who should have protected them the most. Their futures were stolen by adults who can hardly be called parents. And Yaser's family only made everything worse. All of this is nothing but an incredibly tragic story. It's a sad tale, and even those who remain are not entirely innocent.